Real estate agents, did you know that new forms dropped today? And the one I'm getting the most questions about is the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. So I want to show you what the changes are, and be sure to like and subscribe so you get more videos just like this as soon as they come out, because I'm going to be bringing you tons of content about training, about how to get these offers accepted, about how to get these forms signed, about how to fill them out. So make sure that you are following along, because I'm going to be giving you all kinds of helpful tips and tricks, and I'm going to make sure to make real estate easy for you. So let's jump in. So you can see that this form is filled with red. There's all kinds of red on this form. So we're going to go through and we're going to talk about all of the red on here and basically what it means. Now, it just dropped today, so I haven't even gone to a training for it yet. So take it with a grain of salt. I'm just interpreting it how I would interpret it. So that's my disclaimer. Don't hold me to it. You can see that this was revised 7/24. That means it's July of 2024. Make sure you're using the new one. There are tons of stuff that has been revised in this. One of the first things you see, non-exclusive unless exclusive is checked and initialed. So the default to this is going to be that it's a non-exclusive agreement. Now, why did they do this? I'm not 100% sure, because the lawsuit was about the sellers, quote unquote, having to pay the buyer's commission, even though we all know it's always been negotiable. It always has been, always will be. But traditionally, the seller was paying the buyer agent commission. Well, the issue was never that it was exclusive or non-exclusive. So the fact that they're really pushing this non-exclusive is kind of confusing to me. Now, where I do see the benefit is when somebody walks into an open house, they really don't know you, and you're saying, well, you have to sign this agreement. So the default is it's non-exclusive. Let's not worry about it until we get to the point where we're actually making offers. Or maybe we're saying it's a non-exclusive agreement for the first 7 days. And then after that, it's going to be exclusive. We're going to decide if we wanted to work together. You have some options there, and I think that's okay. So let's jump into this and see more of the red. So they added this date prepared. This is the representation period. So it is going to be determined down here. Terms of representation. This is a contractual agreement. The reference paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 5 pages. Buyer is advised to read all 5 pages. If the buyer is advised to read all 5 pages, this is imperative for you as the agent to read every single jot and tittle on this page. You need to make sure you know it, you understand it, you can explain it to your clients. You do not want to be handing them a paper that you've never read before. So be sure you're reading this and understand it. Now, the paragraph number, remember, this corresponds to the information down here. So if you're talking about amount of compensation, that's going to be in paragraph 4B. So let's go down to paragraph 4. Oh, we skipped it. Paragraph 4B, broker right to compensation. And now it's going to include all of this information here. We'll get to that in a second, but I just wanted to give that as an example. So you have a representation period beginning and ending. But here is a new thing. It is not to exceed 3 months. How many of you have had buyers that you've been working with them for a lot longer than 3 months? I know I have. So this to me just seems like now we're going to have added paperwork, because we're going to have to do extensions, or we're going to have to do some, additional agreements or something like that. So to me, this is kind of like annoying, because 3 months is not that long of a time, especially when you're in a strong seller's market, which we've been in for many years, especially in Southern California. So this to me, okay, we'll see if this sticks. But as it stands right now, it is not to exceed 3 months. Type of representation. So here's where it says non-exclusive, or unless this button is checked, it's exclusive. So you have to make sure that it's valid only if checked and initialed. So down below, it has to also have the initial. So again, if you're just walking in and meeting somebody for the first time, I'm not going to expect them to sign an exclusive agreement with me. So I think it's good to say, okay, here's a non-exclusive agreement for a short period of time, and then we're going to reevaluate, see if we want to work together. But my goal is I'm going to give you the best possible service, and so you're going to want to sign with me for every single transaction in the future. So to me, this is not scary. This is not anything. It's just, if anything, it's additional paperwork. Then we have the property type down here. So the property to be acquired, the default is single family residence, including condominiums and manufactured homes. Or if checked, a single family is excluded from this agreement. So if they're looking for a multifamily with 2 to 4 units, you have to check this. Or if they're looking for 5 or more units, industrial, vacant land, commercial, and on and on. This is, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure why they've included this, because if I have a client who's looking for a single family home that they can convert a garage or a duplex, why do I have to specify that? But this is what it is. This is how they're doing it. The location is going to be county or cities. You can add multiple counties. So I work with a lot of agents who are right on the border of LA and Orange County, or Orange County and San Diego County, or Riverside County and LA County, or whatever it is. There are lots of different counties around us that really are close to each other. So if you're in an area where it's likely they're going to be crossing county lines, you want to list all of those out. Additional descriptions, additional buyer preferences and priorities. This is a separate attached form that's totally different, so we're not going to go into that today. Properties excluded from representation. So if, for instance, they have been working with another agent that they signed an agreement with, but they canceled their agreement, but there are still some properties that they looked at with them and they have a 30-day carryover or whatever, those are the properties that are going to be listed here, because if they end up buying, that other agent can potentially get the commission. So you just want to be sure to talk to your clients and understand, is there any property that you've looked at with another agent? All right, this is where we get to the broker compensation. They're saying it's not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. So the amount of compensation is whatever you determine for your own, like, top or bottom, you determine it. It's totally negotiable between you and the buyer. So if you say my fee is X percent, 47%, it probably wouldn't be, but let's just say my fee is 47% and your buyer says, well, actually, I only want to pay you 4%. Again, I'm throwing random numbers out here. Then you can say, okay, I'll agree to 4%. Or you can say, nope, sorry, my commission is 47%, and that's all I'll do it for. That still means it's negotiable. Your buyer is still legally able to negotiate with you, but you're legally able to say, no, I only work for this amount of money. This is going to be something that you determine based on your own business, but it's going to be a really important skill to have to be able to negotiate. You want to make sure that you can properly negotiate this and have them understand that you're still on the same team, especially when you need to now go negotiate for the property that they want. Payments received by broker from seller or others, meaning you can still get payment from the seller. The seller can still choose to give you, the buyer's agent, payment, but you have to negotiate that separately. There's no automatic compensation at all written into any of these documents. If broker receives compensation for seller or others, for broker representation of buyer, the amount shall be credited against the buyer's obligation to pay the broker. So essentially it's going to say the buyer's obligation is to pay, let's just say $5,000, but the seller is going to credit $5,000. So it's going to be buyer's obligation minus the seller credit. Hopefully that equals 0. So essentially the seller is paying the buyer's broker, but really what's happening is it's canceling out. One is a charge that they're going to be paid and the other is a credit. So it's a credit that they're giving. Broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E1. Which is right here. So if you say that you're going to do it for 2.5% and the seller side is offering 3%, you cannot take 3%. You can only take 2% because that's what you've agreed with your buyer. Continued right to payment for broker individual properties. The continuation period shall be blank calendar days after the representation period or any extension. So this is if you have an agreement signed and they say, no, we don't want to work with you anymore. If you put a certain amount of calendar days in here, then anything they go under contract with within those calendar days, you are eligible for that compensation. So if you say 30 days and they go right away and get under contract with something. In my opinion, this helps to protect you as the agent. If you're working with a buyer, they all of a sudden decide to cancel because they walked into an open house and they want to work with that listing agreement because they think that they're going to get a better deal. So they're trying to cancel and not work with you anymore, but you've already done all this work up to this point. So this is kind of protecting you in an instance like that. Cancellation rights and notices, non-exclusive. So the cancellation effective upon receipt or however many days after receipt. So this is receipt of a cancellation. So them saying in writing, I don't want to work with you anymore. If it's an exclusive agreement, then it would be cancellation effective 30 days after the receipt. So after it's 30 days after you are told, I no longer want to work with you. That's again, that time period where you're just being protected in case they are trying to go and make a deal somewhere else. Buyer financial and personal information, time to deliver buyer personal financial information within 5 calendar days from the execution of this agreement. So this is where we're talking about if they're saying they're a cash buyer, we need to have proof of funds. If they're saying they're pre-approved, we need to be able to have proof of that. We need to see that. So this is saying within 3 days, you can change this, or this is saying within 5 days, you could change this to within 3 days or 2 days. Whatever you wanted to do, you could adjust this. The default right here is within 5 days. Other financial considerations, buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay broker. So this is a big one. You're knowing at the beginning that the buyer does not have the funds. So now you know that you're only going to show them properties where the seller is willing to pay your commission because you know that your buyer cannot pay your commission. And we don't work for free. As much as we want to or hope to or think we do, we don't work for free. So you're not going to be finding something that is so overpriced, you're going to have to remove everything, including the seller credit for commission. You don't want to do that because now you're not going to get paid. So this is really good to know in advance because you need to know what types of properties they're going to be able to go after and the types of offers they're going to be able to get accepted. Buyer intends to purchase with the following loan product, which does not allow buyer to pay compensation to broker. I know that the VA loans didn't allow for the buyer to pay the compensation to the buyer's agent. However, I know that they've changed that. So I'm not sure if there are other loan products that don't allow that, but I'm sure there's a lot more information going to be coming out about that. And I'm sure that a lot of those lenders are going to be changing their tune. So we'll see what happens there. Other terms in case there's anything else you want to put in there. The broker compensation advisory is automatically attached. Compensation to broker, this is just more information. And again, remember, this is all the explanation of what was above. So now you had the grid and now down below is the explanation of all of that. So the advisory is the real estate commission included all compensation to fees. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker and are fully negotiable. They just want to spell this out everywhere they can. So you have non-exclusive representation. Compensation is payable only if there is broker involvement in the property. Down here, it explains what the broker involvement is. Exclusive representation, buyer acquisition. If exclusive is checked in paragraph 2A and initialed in paragraph 15, broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period or any extension with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. So if, for instance, you have an exclusive agreement with them, but they walk into an open house and they say, oh, no, I'm not working with an agent, they sign with somebody else, you are still eligible for that compensation. That's why these are really, really, really going to become way more important because you're going to be seeing a lot of this. So make sure you know what this means and what you're asking your clients to sign. Buyer includes any person or entity other than the broker related to buyer who in any manner acts on the buyer's behalf to acquire property described. Okay, great. So that's the buyer. Maybe it's other people working on the buyer's behalf. Maybe it's an entity, whatever it is, but it's not the broker. Broker involvement, here we go. Buyer physically entered and was shown the property by the broker. Broker showed the property to the buyer virtually. Broker submitted to seller a signed written offer from the buyer to acquire, lease, exchange, or obtain an option on the property. Broker performed a market analysis related to the property or reviewed property-specific documents or disclosures with the buyer. The property was introduced to buyer by broker or one for which broker acted on buyer's behalf. However, Merely sending the buyer a list of properties shall not be deemed broker involvement without documentation action on the part of the broker analyzing the property for the buyer, specifically or assisting the buyer in potential acquisition of the property, or communicating with seller or seller's agent regarding the buyer's potential acquisition of the property. So basically they're saying, if you're actively working and actively involved in showing your buyer properties, in analyzing deals, in trying to see if this would work for them, and talking with the sellers, that is your involvement. But if you just put them on an MLS drip, that is not your involvement. You need to show that you're actively involved and that they're working with you to ask questions and to get information from you. So these are two very different things, and it's interesting that I feel like they kind of slid that in there. Continuation of right to compensation for broker-involved properties. Broker shall be entitled to compensation provided for in paragraph 2E if during the continuation period specified, buyer enters into an agreement to acquire property for which there was broker involvement. Broker's right to compensation pursuant to this property shall only apply if prior to the expiration of this agreement or any extension, broker delivers buyer with a written notice of these properties for which there was broker involvement. So this is if you are no longer able to work with a client, they fired you, you fired them, whatever. If you send them a list of properties, now they have this list of properties that if they go into contract on these, you might still be eligible for compensation. Timing of compensation. This is talking about when it's payable. It's usually through escrow. Acquisition is prevented by default of buyer. If acquisition is prevented by a party to the transaction other than the buyer, when the buyer collects damages or obtains specific performance by suit or settlement or otherwise, if damages are recovered, compensation shall equal 1/2 of the damages recovered, not to exceed the compensation provided for in paragraph 2E, after first deducting the unreimbursed payments, credits, and expenses of collection and suit, if any. This is talking about if there is a suit, a lawsuit, something like that. In general, it comes at the completion of the transaction through escrow. Here is talking about payment through escrow, accounting for payments to broker if broker also represents the seller. If broker has signed a listing agreement with the seller of the property to be purchased, buyer shall not receive a credit for the compensation the seller owes the broker for representing the seller. So basically it's saying those two amounts of compensation, totally separate. Listing and buyer, totally separate. Payments received from others less than buyer compensation obligation. Broker and buyer should discuss whether it would be beneficial to include a term in any offer buyer makes by obligating the seller to pay the broker directly or through escrow for some or all of the compensation that the buyer owes the broker. The agent is talking to the buyer to see if it would be beneficial to require that the seller pay instead of the buyer. So this would be in the instance where the buyer can't pay for the commission. And then, of course, if the seller does not pay as contractually required, buyer assigns to broker as a third-party beneficiary any rights buyer has to pursue the seller for such compensation. So the seller is actually giving the money to the buyer through escrow, but the buyer is assigning that money to the agent. And so this sentence is basically saying that the agent is eligible to go after that money. Disclosure of payments to broker. Broker independently or through escrow will disclose the final compensation broker receives from anyone other than the buyer. So if the seller ends up paying, it's going to be disclosed exactly how much the agent got. Cancellation of buyer representation agreement. You can cancel at any time. The buyer or the broker can cancel at any time. There's nothing different about that. It just needs to be written notice within the time specified, because if it's outside of the time specified, you don't even need to cancel. And then we have properties excluded from the representation. So this whole area is talking about if they sign with multiple agents. I'm sure that's going to come up. They just have put this in because they know that that's likely what somebody would do. If they are going into different open houses saying, sure, I'll work with you, sure, I'll work with you, sure, I'll work with you. We don't want to deal with that. And so here we have buyer shall inform broker in writing if buyer has signed any other buyer representation agreements, whether exclusive or non-exclusive with any other broker for any property described in paragraph 2B. Buyer shall disclose to broker if any other broker showed property, such as property virtually or in person, or wrote an offer on or otherwise acted on buyer's behalf for such property. Buyer may owe compensation to that broker if buyer purchases such property. So this is why we have that list of properties. If buyer has signed an exclusive buyer representation agreement with another broker that has not expired or been terminated, buyer may owe compensation to that broker if buyer purchases such property, even if that other broker had no involvement with the property. So this is why your exclusive agreements are really important. If they start walking into an open house and try and work with that agent who's holding the open house, you might be cut out of the deal, but you're still entitled to compensation because you had a written exclusive agreement. Buyer shall disclose any property for which buyer is obligated to pay another broker. Okay. Conflicts with other broker, unless otherwise notified by buyer, buyer acknowledges that for the property identified, blah, 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 excluding one, has not entered into an exclusive representation agreement with another broker, and two, has no obligation, even under a non-exclusive representation agreement, to pay compensation to any broker arising out of the acquisition of the property. So this is the buyer saying they're not working with another agent. Limitation on broker representation. If a property is excluded during the time the buyer is obligated to compensate another broker, broker is not obligated to assist buyer with respect to that property, and buyer shall not owe broker compensation under this agreement for that property. So if they have another agent that they were working with for one of those listed properties, you as their new agent are not required to work with them or help them on that property because you're not getting compensated for it. Broker agrees to exercise reasonable effort and due diligence to achieve the purpose of this agreement. Interesting that they had to add that in. Financial and personal information. Within the time specified in paragraph 2G, which is your time frame, buyer shall provide the relevant personal and financial information, including proof of funds needed to complete the purchase of the property and satisfy obligation to the broker. So they added this. Basically, they're saying the buyer has to provide proof of funds, saying that they not only can pay whatever cash they need to pay at close of escrow, they can also pay the buyer's obligation. For any property to which the buyer writes an offer to purchase, the buyer agrees to include a term in the buyer's offer requesting seller to compensate buyer's broker. So it's saying they're agreeing to requesting that the seller pays for that. And B, for a transaction, this agreement is contingent upon sellers or others or both agreeing to pay broker the full amount that the buyer is contractually obligated to pay the broker. So the buyer is saying, yes, I am willing to pay you, but it's going to be paid from a seller credit because they're already saying, I don't have the money to pay. So it has to come from somewhere else. That's where it's really good to have this kind of thing in writing because you're agreeing ahead of time that you're saying we're only going to look at things if the seller is willing to pay because there's no other way that the agent is going to get paid. So you have to make sure you get paid one way or another. This is an update for buyer material issues. For any property for which the buyer has made an offer or are considering making an offer, buyer shall notify or update broker in writing of any material issues to buyer for that property, such as, but not limited to, buyer requests for information or concerns regarding any subject interests of property. If buyer does not provide such information for a property for which buyer makes an offer, that property shall be deemed to satisfy the buyer's material considerations, notwithstanding any preferences and priorities identified in the BAPP if one has been completed. So this is saying if they have additional requirements, like maybe they're saying it can't have popcorn ceilings or it has to have an AC or something like that. This is where it's basically saying unless the buyer brings it up, they're agreeing that everything is good with it. Management approval. If an associate or licensee in broker's office, salesperson or broker associate enters into this agreement on broker's behalf, broker or manager has the right to cancel this agreement in writing in 5 days of its execution. This is a new one that they've added in, and I'm not sure why. If it's because they've had issues with this and maybe it's because people are not following the rules or doing it right. I don't know, but maybe that's why they added this in. Legally authorized signer. This is just saying that they are a legal authorized signer. Now here's where they've added in exclusive representation. So the buyer has to check this if it's exclusive representation. And it's saying this agreement shall be exclusive. Broker will devote time and resources to assist buyer in finding and acquiring the property in the expectation of being paid for broker services. Buyer shall not enter into another representation agreement in conflict with this agreement. Broker is entitled to compensation if buyer acquires property during the representation period with or without broker involvement, even if another broker is also entitled to be paid for representing the buyer. So again, it's just cementing, solidifying in stone. Basically, whoever's is dated first, whoever the buyer agreed to work with first is the one who's going to win. So the buyer is saying, I'm acknowledging that I'm not working with any other buyer's agent. And so they're agreeing to work with you exclusively. Cancellation. Either buyer or broker may unilaterally cancel this agreement by giving the other 30 days written notice. If within 5 days after the effective date of the cancellation, broker provides buyer a list of properties for which there was broker involvement, broker may still be entitled to compensation if buyer purchases one of the properties on the list during the representation or the continuation period. So again, this is saying either side, either the buyer or the agent, can cancel at any time. If they cancel at any time, the agent must give a list of properties that they've worked with this client on. And any of those properties, if they enter contract on those, you can be eligible for that compensation. And then confirmation of compensation. Buyer confirms that the compensation specified in paragraph 2E1 for broker's services is whatever you determine for the acquisition price and however much money or a certain dollar amount as specified or something specified in the attached compensation schedule. The rest of this is stuff that they've just been updating in all the forms. The rest of this is stuff they've just been updating in all the forms. So it's talking about trusts or LLCs or anything like that, entities. And then the broker agent signature and if more than one broker is representing them. Well, that was it. We've come to the end. I hope that helped. And remember, there's a lot more stuff that's going to be coming out about this. And I want to make sure that I'm bringing you all of the content in really relevant time, trainings, how to fill these out, how to talk to your clients. So be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything. And I'll see you in the next video.